Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Additional funding provided by Idaho National Laboratory, where for 60 years the energy of innovation has lighted the way to progress in energy and national security, basic and applied science and engineering technology, and the education of Idaho's next generation of researchers.
Most of us know the Earth revolves around the sun, but less than half of U.S. adults can explain why you see lightning before hearing thunder. Science literacy is the key to America's economic future, and it starts with STEM education. Find out more. Dialogue is next. Hello, I'm Joan Cartan Hansen. Thank you for joining us here on Idaho Public Television, on the World Wide Web, and on public radio stations. STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The National Science Foundation estimates that 80% of the jobs created in the next decade will require some form of math and science skills. And yet, 3/4 of Americans' 8th graders are not proficient in math, and far too few students go into college to study STEM fields. Governors across the political spectrum and President Obama have called for America's classrooms to integrate STEM teaching from preschool to graduate school. But how? Tonight we'll look at STEM education here in Idaho, and in a few moments we'll be taking your phone calls. But first, I spoke earlier with Joan Ferrari-Mundy and Sue Allen from the National Science Foundation to explain what STEM education is. Thank you both for joining us here on Dialogue. Let me start by introducing you more formally. Joan Ferrari-Mundy is the Assistant Director of the Education and Human Resources Division of the National Science Foundation, and Sue Allen is the Acting Director for the Division on Research and Learning in Formal and Informal Settings. Joan, your division oversees research and development in science education, and Sue, your area includes, among other things, research and learning outside of the classroom. In this, why is there such a push currently for STEM education? And perhaps we should start with, what is STEM education?
That's a great question. Actually, it's a fairly recent term, and for us it's become kind of a useful shorthand. STEM in full is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And those are related fields in science. Actually, one of the reasons that we kind of use this little convenient shorthand is that a lot of science is now multidisciplinary, and that really those sorts of skills kind of overlap in terms of real science, and also in terms of careers, as we'll, I guess, talk about in a minute, and also in terms of the kinds of skills. All of them sort of have similar requirements in terms of like critical thinking and analytical skills and problem solving. So there's a nice sort of a little cluster of concepts there.
Why is it so important now to push STEM education?
Well, almost every national report that we read talks about the importance of STEM as we seek to be a nation that's innovative, that's leading the world in creating solutions to some of society's hardest problems. STEM turns out to be central in solving a lot of those problems, and at the same time, STEM is pretty central in everybody's everyday life too, as you think about making decisions about your health, as you make decisions about how to even understand the newspaper and look at economic information and so on. And so we are pleased here at the National Science Foundation that there's such a national focus on the importance of these areas, which is where we really make our most specialized investments in education.
Why aren't Americans as prepared in areas of STEM education as they should be?
Well, it's true that American results on the international studies are not always as encouraging as we'd like for them to be. It's complicated, of course. First of all, what happens in the K through 12 grades is really very important for STEM because it sets the foundation for what our students might do in post-secondary education or in the workforce directly. So one area of great focus, of course, is on ensuring that we have really solid, interesting, compelling instructional materials for learners K through 12, and that those are coherent so that what one studies in the 3rd grade then isn't necessarily repeated and redone in the 4th grade, but we build on that and we move to the next topics. So one concern, of course, is to be sure that we have coherence and solid preparation for the students in terms of what they're seeing in their instructional materials. At the same time, being sure that teachers are really well prepared to teach their disciplines, particularly in K through 12, another major area of focus. And then finally, with the diversity of the nation's classrooms, it's really important that teachers have the preparation to work well with students who bring a whole range of very different experiences to the classroom. And so our agency is very focused on trying to invest in the very best ideas in the country to be sure that these kinds of areas are improved.
It's hard for a lot of teachers these days to think about STEM education when they have a couple of different things kind of on their plate. First of all, let's talk about No Child Left Behind. It didn't really focus on science. What impact had that had on science learning and science literacy to this point?
Yeah, that's one of the big concerns in the science community, is that, of course, we are a nation now teaching to the test, and to the extent that math and English language arts are really dominating the accountability on the national scale, we have a corresponding reduction that we're seeing in a lot of classrooms around the nation where there's less time for science, particularly at the elementary grades. There's often very little time for science, but also in the middle school. So that is a major concern.
Is there something the National Science Foundation can do to help change that? Is there some national policy you'd like to work on?
Well, of course, a lot of education in this nation is state-based. We also are very interested in helping with that, and one of the ways that we're helping is supporting research and studies on the Common Core standards, which are now, of course, happening in mathematics and English language arts and are coming in science. There's a framework that's about to come out very soon in the next few months about science, and will have some of the same qualities we expect in terms of emphasizing learning of a smaller number of topics, not 1,000 ideas sort of in a shallow way, but a few really core concepts in science and studying them deeply. And so states that subscribe to that approach will be looking for ways to align to those standards and help students and teachers to be assessing to those standards and learning material in a more flexible and deep way, which research has shown does provide long-term success more so than having a very shallow curriculum.
Could you explain take one of those concepts that you think is important to teach that'll be part of the core standards?
Let's see. Well, one idea, actually, I know that the actual document is under review right now, so I can pick an example from my recollection, and it may not actually be in the final standards. So with that said, one of the ideas I think that's really key is the idea of scaling of different phenomena. In the physical sciences, you have properties that are very different as you scale from small things to larger things. And this is very important if you're building bridges, to know that an infrastructure at a certain scale, when you double the size of something, its volume goes up 8 times. And that has enormous implications for everything from, architecture and engineering to health treatments and living organisms, the size of organisms, and so there's just tremendous applicability of a general powerful idea like that.
And I would chime in on that if it's okay, because I come from the mathematics field, and a key mathematical concept that is in the Common Core standards has to do with fractions and proportional thinking, which is the foundational mathematics that leads to this ability to do scaling. So when you think about reading maps or imagining the ratios between various kinds of quantities, it's a mathematical foundation in fractions that starts as early as the 2nd grade that enables us by middle school then to really to move into these science applications in much more interesting ways.
Are there changes coming in how we think of science literacy for outside the classroom, in those more informal learning settings?
Yeah, that's such a great area, and a really exploding area, I would say, is that we're really moving, and technology has helped a lot, I think, in terms of the mobile applications that people are carrying every day, of course the internet, and all these various technologies that are allowing us to really learn so much outside the classroom. And I think we all do it every day. We use these sort of online resources, or we go to Wikipedia to find out things. We have a huge number of informal science resources available to people, and some of the ones that NSF funds in particular are some of the broadcast things that you'll find on TV, especially for young kids. We have things like PEEP and Cyberchase that are available for and SciGirls for younger learners. and right up through Nova and Nova Science Now and those sorts of specials available. So there's a whole broadcast set of media. And often now, one of the changes is that those tend to have links to the internet so that you can follow up in your family if you're interested in that topic and find out more, engage in games, find out about other organizations and institutions that are doing similar things. There's also a lot of, one other thing I wanted to just highlight for possibly interested viewers is the citizen science movement, which is becoming increasingly popular and a fascinating area to invest some of your leisure time, if you have leisure time, which is that we have increasingly scientists are turning to the public to help them with answering real research questions. A lot of them are sort of environmental questions about populations of birds or squirrels. Some of them are questions about the galaxies. You can sign up and learn how to identify galaxies and really be furthering the research. And you can also now ask questions of these sorts of databases, helping to identify craters on the moon and what this says about the history of our planetary system. And so many other acoustics, learning about, there are scientists trying to discover what kinds of acoustic environments make us feel different ways. So there are just a lot of different citizen science projects on the go, and they usually are really fun to do. You can sign up and learn some skills and to essentially become a scientist yourself for a short period of time and get a feel for what it's like to really contribute to some real research.
Is that line between formal learning and informal learning blurring? Has technology kind of pushed that to blur together?
Very much so. We're seeing that more and more. And I was just noticing last weekend I uploaded the new Smithsonian's application. I think it's called LeafSnap, which allows you to carry on your little mobile phone a little application that allows you to take a photograph of a leaf that you see, and it's uploaded, and they try to identify it for you. And there's also a little game where you can test your skills and find out as you get better to practice on some things and then try to identify trees yourself. So I think this there's a lot of ways that people are turning to the internet, and also communities. I mean, that's the other thing that's happening, is we have people who are interested in similar things spontaneously getting together and talking to each other as they're finding out more about science and the world around them.
The other, besides No Child Left Behind and its emphasis not on science, the other big issue in the classrooms, at least at all levels, K through university, is the amount of money devoted to science. Does it concern you that as budgets are being cut across the state that science is going to get lost?
Well, I think one, at the National Science Foundation, the kind of thing that we're able to do is to invest in the development of the very best, most cutting-edge, interesting ideas for classroom science, for out-of-school science, for resources that can be made available widely to teachers and to students. And so I think it's always challenging in constrained resource times to do things well, but nonetheless there are lots of ways to bring the fundamental ideas of science into the classroom that are out and available and relatively inexpensive. And so I think the challenge is to be sure that teachers have the background and inclination and preparation to be creative with their teaching of science, to go and look for resources and to combine them well to help their students connect to the out-of-school science resources that are available, and to build curricular coherence through what they can assemble in interesting ways.
I was just going to chime in there too, that one of the things to really bear in mind about STEM areas is that they really are, we see them at NSF as a major investment in the economy, that these are really not so much costs as money that comes back multiple fold. And if you look back at the economic data over the last century, actually, you find that in America the US investments in science and technology are responsible for, I think, I've heard estimates of up to a half of the massive growth in per capita wealth in the country. So we really have been fueled by these investments in science and technology expertise, and the predictions that you hear coming from the National Academy of Sciences and other places are that this is only going to be more so, that really where we need to go is that if 4% is an estimate that I've heard from those studies, 4% of the of the workers in the US are in STEM fields, and those people are really leveraging expertise for the other 96%. So this is just a hugely important area for us to be investing in, because those, also the expansion, those are the jobs in technology, engineering, science and mathematics, not even just the specific jobs of people who are professional scientists, but that tier of technicians and people who are in technical fields, nursing, medical care, biomedical technology, all those sorts of fields are going to be the areas that are going to show most expansion. So this is an area where, for our own economic benefit, we really want to be investing heavily.
Is there an age where we lose kids? Their interest, I mean, because kids have such a wonderful, imagine, you know, especially elementary school kids, they love science, it's so cool, but we seem to lose them. Is there a key age that we need to worry about?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Yeah, the research suggests that we lose people at different stages. One of the key stages that we do lose people is in the transition from high school to college. What we find is that one of the issues around this is actually gender too, is that boys and girls are both doing very equally well in high schools, and then round about college is where we lose a lot of people, and in particular we lose girls. Some of the research has interestingly shown that even though that's where it shows up as an issue, often what's happening is that we're losing that group of people much earlier. There was a wonderful study by Robert Tye that showed that by 8th grade, actually, students generally can tell if they are expecting to be in a STEM field or not. And it turns out that their sort of anticipation and interest in being in a STEM field at 8th grade or by 8th grade is a better predictor of whether they will actually graduate in a STEM field than their achievement level. So this was sort of a wake-up call to us that actually the interest is being set quite a bit earlier than we thought. And I think it's one of the other research findings I'll just mention around the age question is that we've learned over the last 10 years that we used to think that very young kids couldn't really do proper science, but they couldn't do sort of analysis or causal reasoning or those sorts of advanced science things until they were in 13 or 14. And what we've learned is that actually that isn't true at all, that even very young, even infants actually are doing a version of causal reasoning that is really quite impressive. So one of the shifts I think that's happening is that we're realizing that getting to kids really younger and keeping that enthusiasm that you mentioned at the elementary grades and very young is really key to supporting them and helping them realize that there are really exciting things in this field that they can move forward with.
You know, I think a piece of that has to do with teachers believing that kids can do science and mathematics from young ages and that they can do sophisticated reasoning, sophisticated logic. In informal ways, essentially. And so a part of this is about having high expectations for kids, making sure that they do get to tackle hard and challenging problems and learn to stay with those. In mathematics, to learn that not everything gets done in 1 or 2 minutes sometimes. And so to combine the expectation that these are complex, challenging fields, but very young learners can do a very great amount of thinking is really important in the teaching.
And actually, can I riff off that for a moment and just say another piece of research that I found fascinating is about Carol Dweck has done some work on people's beliefs about intelligence. It turns out that the population is kind of split half-half. Half of us think that intelligence is something innate that you're just born with, and the other half think that it's something that you can acquire through effort. And it turns out that and particularly, I think, the STEM fields, mathematics and science, are susceptible to that. You know, I'm good at science, or I've never been good at science. It turns out that there's a lot of research now showing that what you believe really affects how well you do. And it's actually the people who believe in the effort model and the I have to work to get there model, that the idea of perseverance in the face of adversity, that is exactly what gets you through the challenges to the level of expertise, to success. And it affects grades, it affects success in careers. So one of the things that I would encourage folks to think about when they're working with their families and in any kind of teaching setting is to encourage people, don't say to them, well done, you have an innate, you're good at this. as much as saying, well done that you made the effort and that you're struggling and working and striving, that actually is not just a nice thing to say to people, but it is actually at the heart of what can make performance better.
There's a national study that was just recently released. About making STEM education more concrete in the classroom? Could you tell me just a little bit about that?
Yes, sure. This is a study that the National Science Foundation requested be performed by the National Research Council, and this is because Congressman Frank Wolf from Virginia has been very concerned about K-12 STEM performance in the country, and he challenged all of us to find out what are the best practices around the country in STEM education, and how can we sort of summarize those and do a better job in making that well known across the country so that schools can begin to move in these positive directions. So the report has been completed, the first stage of it has been released, and this does focus on some fairly major categories that have to do with instructional practices that can lead to improved STEM performance, as well as features about schools and school context that have to do with supportive administration, administrators that understand the directions and needs of STEM teachers, support for teachers in general, and then relative to instruction, again, high expectations and a focus on bringing students high quality experiences. So we see this report as a great jumping off point for all of us across the country to use as a conversation starter for how to put our focus on improving K-12 STEM education.
And I'll just chime in there and say one of the things that came out of the report that I thought was particularly interesting was several characteristics of schools and districts that have had shown increases in their test scores, and spectacular increases in terms of math and science, or significant, I should say. And one of the findings was that one characteristic is involvement of parents and communities in school life, and schools that are welcoming of parent involvement and that connect to community organizations. And I just mention that again for any of your viewers who might be wondering how they can contribute and get involved if they're not actually teachers themselves. Being involved is really shown by research to be a very helpful thing.
Before we end up with this interview, I did want to get a piece of advice from both of you. How would you advise policymakers here in Idaho to improve STEM education here locally at the K-12 level and also at the college level?
Well, one thing I think we really hope they would embrace the standards movement, these Common Core standards being part of a national conversation, but really driven by the needs of the states. The research report talks about the importance of a coherent, rigorous, aligned set of standards, and the NRC has really worked hard to put such a thing together with a lot of input from folks around the country. So I think aligning, taking a real careful look at that and considering aligning with the science standards as Idaho has already done with math, I think would be a really great start. Also, from some of these studies, investing in leadership, creating a school climate. It turns out that leadership and the commitment of leadership to create a climate where teachers are always learning, where they're getting extended, coherent professional development is really critical. So supporting the leadership of schools and districts is one key component.
And I would just add to that in the policy environment, which sometimes separates the K-12 community from the higher ed community, I think that the articulation between the two is really quite crucial. So making sure that as policymakers tackle issues of improving STEM education, as they think about assessment, as they think about high school graduation requirements, as well as college entry, higher ed entry requirements, assessments, and so forth, if everybody's sort of in the same room with the K-12 folks talking to the higher ed groups, as well as to those who are involved in teacher preparation, which sometimes is yet again a little bit disconnected. I think coherence in policy is really important to create the kinds of environments that will allow everybody to thrive in STEM.
Well, Joan, Sue, thank you very much for joining us there in Virginia. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Thanks for inviting us. It was terrific.
And we'll continue the discussion now here in Idaho. In our Moscow studio is James Gregson, Associate Dean of Graduate Studies and the STEM Coordinator for the University of Idaho. Thank you for joining us there in Moscow.
Thank you for having me.
And joining us here in our Boise studio is Lewis Nadelson, Assistant Professor of Education and the STEM Coordinator for Boise State University. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Also joining us is Holly McLean, Principal of the Treasure Valley Math and Science Center. Holly, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Chris Taylor, an 8th grade Earth Science teacher and STEM education mentor. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And Jefferson Jewell, Managing Director of Blackfin Technology and an advocate for STEM education. Sir, thank you for being here.
Good to be here.
And of course, we want to hear from you. Just join the conversation. Give us a call, toll free, at 1-800-973-9800. So we started this conversation on that national level. Now let's look at Idaho. What's the status of STEM education in Idaho? Should we start with you, Holly?
Absolutely. I think recognizing that we are a smaller state, we have a limited tax base, we do have pockets of impressive development in this field. We are making headway in putting really innovative programs out there in communities all over the state. We have partnerships between higher education, corporate interests, and even with collaboration between different school districts that benefit communities and provide opportunities in a really responsible financial way that provide those opportunities that larger communities are able to provide. And I think that is really, at this point in time, it's impressive that we're able to do this.
Let me jump to the university level. I'll start with you, James. How is STEM education on campus in Moscow?
You know, I think this is a very rich, opportune time for STEM education. I think great progress has been made, similar to what Holly has characterized. I can't recall in my over 2 decades in higher education a time in which a College of Education faculty have had the rich dialogue and the meaningful work involved with colleagues from numerous colleges that address various aspects of STEM. In addition to that, the public-private partnerships are really becoming increasingly pervasive. But with that said, I think we also still recognize we're not there yet. We're becoming. Essentially, I think we still work in various silos. There's a famous quote I like to reference of higher education has disciplines, the real world has problems. And so oftentimes disciplines, while they can really address a particular problem in one particular way, the problems are becoming increasingly complex, and I thought that the NSF officers really recognized that in their conversation.
How about a BSU?
So, you know, to echo some of what Jim has shared here, there is an awful lot of work being done in STEM education. There's a lot of collaboration that's happening between different colleges and within the College of Education and within the community and with business and industry. There have been some statewide movements as well in terms of trying to improve STEM education, the iSTEM and EBSCOR initiatives. The State Board of Education is putting together a STEM summit to explore some of the issues with STEM education. Also echoing what Jim had said, there's an awful lot of work that probably still needs to be done. We aren't there yet. The Change the Equation came out with its vital signs recently, and it showed that Idaho is not performing probably quite as well as we would like it to be. And so I think there's an awful lot of opportunity to address STEM education here in Idaho. As I work with some of the folks in NSF, and we're working on an initiative to address STEM education in Idaho, they thought that was awfully ambitious. And then when I pointed out there are a number of school districts in the United States that are much larger than the student population in Idaho, they suddenly realized that this may be attainable, and so we have their attention in terms of what we might be able to do and to address STEM education.
Let's ask Jefferson, as the person in business, how important is it to have a good educated workforce in STEM?
It's hugely important. You know, in our business, our life's blood is people. I mean, a lot of businesses say that, but I mean, it's huge. We have software engineers and we have people who aren't engineers but need to be articulate in technical matters, need to understand an object model, need to be able to solve a problem. They need to be able to apply the scientific method mostly to non-scientific problems. And so STEM education is the output is extremely important. I mean, you know, we're in need. You know, there are 4 different offices or campuses for our company. We have roughly 400 people in the company. We have 67 unfilled job recs right now between here and Seattle and North Dakota and North Carolina, and it's because we can't find enough people who are qualified. So I mean, so the opportunity is there for the students.
Well, Chris, we'll start in it starts in your classroom. You started with the elementary school, and you're now moving into that. You're in that 8th grade year that you're moving into. That's a key year, according to studies. That's the year where we start losing kids. What advice do you have? Why is that year crucial, and why are we losing them?
And I sure see elementary as well. Being an elementary teacher the last 15 years, I see that's where it needs to start. I know the NSF said that K-5 year, those years, we've got to get that science education. I'm excited to see what's happening in the state with STEM education. From a teacher standpoint, we still got a long ways to go. The professional development needs to be there for those teachers, and we just need to continue that. Because with all the testing right now, teachers are struggling getting that science taught in the classroom. And hearing from industry right here, it is so important that we get that in the classrooms.
You know, there are some elementary schools in Idaho that have just abandoned teaching any science at all. They only, because of No Child Left Behind, they only do math, they only do reading. What does that set? How is that going to set us up and then for the next generation? How big of a problem is that?
Well, you know, as a preparer of teachers, and then we work a lot with teacher professional development, I think that it's critical that we address that. And I think that one of the ways to address that is to show teachers and provide teachers with models that allow them to see how science and engineering and some of these other areas of STEM can be taught while still addressing mathematics and English language arts. That in fact it may make the curriculum richer and engage the students to a much higher degree, but the professional development, as Chris said, is critical to providing them with, you know, the capacity to do that.
Bill emailed a question in before the show asking, besides funding, what hurdles do educators face to integrate STEM education in their classroom? So what are some of the hurdles?
I think Lewis hit it right on. I think it's right now the testing the teachers are feeling with the reading and math. At this point in time, science is not part of the AYP in our state, even though we do test it in 3 grade levels. But I think what teachers need to remember is that is getting more rich with that integration, and we need to look at how can we incorporate reading into the science? How can we incorporate the humanities into the science? Because it can be done. But again, we need a lot of that professional development to help those teachers out with that, because science is not a strong point for a lot of those elementary teachers.
At the junior high and high school level, how do you integrate science into the classroom where they may not have?
In the Treasure Valley Math and Science Center, we were designed to have integration built into every level of the program. And the way we perceive it is the science is the context for the mathematics. The mathematics is the language of the science. And by having the teachers collaborate in their delivery and their planning, in some of the opportunities they provide for the students, it allows them to see the richer nature of those 2 fields. And that extends over the years to developing more of a passion for the subject areas. It's not just about being able to pass a test. If you have keen interest in those areas, you're going to bring more to it and just soar through those tests. It also develops those language areas and communication skills, because being an effective scientist or a mathematician requires you to communicate your findings, the things that you find interesting, your thought patterns.
Let's take a look at some of the recommendations.
If I could chime in.
Sure, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, pardon me.
No.
If I could chime in here, a central theme of several of the projects the University of Idaho has been involved in is this notion of place-based education. Because of our land-grant mission, oftentimes we're very focused on issues related to agriculture, natural resources, energy. These themes are themes that really matter to Idaho communities, and oftentimes when you kind of situate STEM within the needs and interests of the communities, you increase that parental involvement, you increase business and industry's interest in that. And so I think it also really ignites engagement, not only among the educators, but also the students. And so I think one of the challenges then is this notion of STEM is rather abstract to a lot of people. But again, when it's kind of contextualized within the needs and interests and attributes of a given community, it becomes real and meaningful.
I want to jump into the report, some of the findings from the National Research, some of their recommendations. The first one being open STEM-focused schools that be selective, magnet, and STEM-focused career and technical. Let's talk about selective. The Treasure Valley Math and Science Center is Idaho's selective school. Could you describe how your school works?
Absolutely. The school was designed back in 2004. Boise School District, in collaboration with higher education and local businesses, wanted to create an opportunity for students to explore these fields very richly, bringing them in at the entry point of junior high and taking them right through graduation. And the program allows them to be at the school for part of each day, and they can accelerate through the subject areas more rapidly, so we have some students that come in at a very young age. We involve them in student-centered, inquiry-based exploration of these subjects. And this was designed to be in partnership with the community so that we have people from, let's say, researchers from the universities, people from Micron Technology or St. Luke's come into our schools and talk about how they came into their fields. They become role models for these students. They invite the students out to their workplaces and let them see the relevance in their community, but also in the larger picture, and how going into these fields can really help contribute to the betterment of society and the world. This program has been hugely successful. These students, without exception, go on to enter college in fields that they are passionately interested in and well prepared to be successful in pursuing.
And it's a selective, so you take a test to get in. So it's not
the selective,
unlike a magnet school that anyone can, with an interest, could enter.
Right.
This is one you have to test
well,
to get in.
It's a magnet school that serves the entire valley, although it's a school within Boise School District. The students, when they go through the selection process, it's more to ensure that they can handle the pacing and the complexity. So it's not just students who are your 4.0 students, highly gifted, that are in there. It's for students that have a real curiosity and interest in these fields.
The next recommendation on the list is to look at giving more time for science in K through 5. How much time when you were teaching, how much time did you actually have for science?
I'm a science lover, so we spend about 45 minutes a day on science, but in that, integrating the language arts novels were all related with science, integrating the math, the engineering with the design process as well. But it was interesting, Barbara Morgan just sent 15 teachers down to Houston for a STEM conference. And we are really doing well in Idaho. I've been real impressed because there was 200 teachers from around the country, and they have just started this STEM talk. So I see that our state is on that move, and I think that was all 3rd through 6th grade teachers, and we're really starting with that elementary. I think that's a key point that they mentioned.
Could I add something to that? The Center on Educational Policy released a report that said, that stated that the average K-5 classroom is teaching about 45 minutes of science a week. So 45 minutes of science a day is 5 times more than the national average. And so, that's where we're at. So there's definitely an opportunity to increase that.
The next one is enhance capacity for K through 12 teachers, more professional development, and ensure STEM curricula are focused and rigorous. So that setting that standard high. Now there's a downside to setting a high standard that people fail, and in an area of standardized testing, that's bad. That could be really bad for a school.
Right.
Is that a policy that we need to change?
The policy, what policy
Well,
specifically?
it's that debate on, do you set really high standards
Right.
so that, because kids will
Right.
sometimes
Yeah.
more often than not will surprise you by meeting those high standards.
Right.
But then if you have a lot of failures going on in your classroom, policymakers are going to go, oh, that school's not doing a good job, that teacher's not doing a good job, whether it's, where the bar is set. How do you find that balance?
So, as they're looking at the next generation of No Child Left Behind, they're looking, as we've been seeing in the news, as much more of a growth model instead of this punitive, here's the bar, if you don't reach this, you fail. And so I think that if we look at it in terms of setting high standards, and then if people don't achieve those high standards, what resources do they need? What other kinds of professional development or other resources might they need in order to make that goal? So I think that setting high standards is a really important goal in addressing the STEM education. I would say that STEM education limitations that we're dealing with right now, but I think that when people don't reach that goal, we've got to be really thoughtful on how we deal with that.
Yeah, I just want to chime in on that because I completely agree that having high standards is tremendously important. And I think also that when students, it's also important that when students reach those standards, that we don't sort of relax and sort of kick back and say, okay, great, I got another one over the finish line. Because I'm familiar with some of the data, the state funding data on education, and if you didn't know any better, you would think that. And if all you had to go on was based on, okay, where do we spend our money, on what types of students do we spend money, you would think that we were obsessed with mediocrity because, we spend, depending on how you count it, we spend between 10 and 300 times more on students who are in the bottom 10% as the top. And so that's why I am so encouraged, and I applaud what you're doing at the Treasure Valley Math and Science School. I'm sure I got the name wrong, but I'm glad it's there. I want to visit, because I think that's so important. Because historically that's not the way it's been. I'm sure there are reasons for it in the funding models and the way all that works out, but it's distressing to think that we're neglecting the best and the brightest. And that's across the board, whether it's adding points to the SAT scores so that the average is an 800 again. I mean, these things as a parent, they make no sense to me. As a business person, it seems like cheating. So I completely agree that the high standards and then letting students go as far as they can go, that's where great innovations come from.
And James, I know you've been wanting to get in on this.
Absolutely, thank you. Joan, I think that part of the STEM movement has really provided this rich debate on standards. And so I think that upon reflection with No Child Left Behind, we understand that some states set lower standards simply because of that concern for failure. And so I think that the national standards that have been put forward by math and English and now that are being developed in science, I think we're going to address that issue. And so I certainly, with my colleagues here, support that notion of having high, rigorous standards. On the other hand, I think what we have also learned from the research in the past decade on educational reform is that you can set the bar as high as you would like, but if you don't have student engagement and parental and community engagement, it's much like raising the bar for a high jumper. They also need the training and the nourishment to be able to jump higher. And so I think that it's been a more comprehensive discussion. I also value the report's discussion on how you measure whether or not you're actually meeting those high standards. Certainly standardized test scores have a place, but I think we also understand that the complexity of these real-world problems don't always lend themselves to multiple choice examination types of assessments.
Well, especially in science, how does a rural school district who has their physics teacher online, how does that student in another district or another county actually do the hands-on part of that job? I mean, you can't really do physics well if you are just watching on a screen. So how do you get around that?
You know, I think that it comes back to something we talked about earlier, and that is really good teacher professional development and really good teacher preparation. You know, if we're going to go with a distance model, then we really need to look at what is the most effective way to do that, to engage students, as Jim has talked about, but then also to make sure that the teachers are well prepared to deal with those different kinds of environments so that the students do receive the quality kind of STEM education that you're talking about with the hands-on activities. You know, our research that we've done shows that we're going to need about 420 science and about 510 math teachers in the next 5 years. And so that's a tremendous number of teachers, but it also shows there's going to be this turnover in there. And so here's a great opportunity to make sure that next generation of teachers is prepared to deal with some of these challenges.
I know you wanted to get back in on that, James. You know what?
So one of the things I would also...
No, go ahead.
One of the things, oh, okay, pardon me. One of the things I'd like to elaborate on is that notion of, I'm really excited about some of the hybrid approaches now, so that you can have intensive experiential hands-on learning that Lewis has referenced, as well as having students collect data in their respective communities and comparing that data with data that other students have collected in other communities. And NASA, USDA, National Geographic, a lot of these national organizations and agencies have provided databases that students are talking to one another, not only across the nation, but across the planet, and comparing that data, but yet it's coupled with intensive experiential learning experiences in their respective community.
Before we get away from the high standards question, I wanted to throw out some research that showed that those first level college classes that are designed to weed out students have a different impact on men versus women. And we'll maybe talk about gender differences there, but with women who would get a B in the class think that they failed and drop out, and men who got a C in the class thought they did just fine and would continue on. How do you, should we have first level science? Are we beyond the point where we need to weed people out when we start in college in science? Or and how do we deal with the gender differences? Okay, well, I just threw out a question that'll take the rest of the half an hour, but let's just start down there a little bit.
I'll start and throw something out here real quick. You know, I brought that up today at a meeting of some of the other STEM researchers that I'm working with at Boise State, and we are not really aware of that in our classes and so forth, but we definitely are looking into that. But the weed out classes in general, not necessarily the gender differences, is a huge concern across the disciplines, because it's really critical that students are provided with not only the opportunity but the foundational knowledge in STEM, as we heard earlier from NSF, that there's so much STEM happening in our society and daily lives that it's critical everybody receives at least foundational knowledge in there. But we don't want to discourage people, we want to encourage them. And so I think that's some area that we certainly need to continue to address and look at. But I think the day and age of the weed out class are fading fast.
We actually have a caller, so let's get our first caller in line. Cecilia in Boise. Cecilia?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, my interest solely is in an important discipline. Children are learning at a point in their lives when they're very vulnerable, and I think a discipline that allows them to recognize the importance of the teacher and the subject that they're needing to learn is vital.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for your call. Let me because we're rapidly running out of time, I'm going to bring that second. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Joan, I would just also add, higher learning institutions are now being really scrutinized for retention rates. And I think part of the STEM movement has contributed to that dialogue that we were referencing earlier among faculty from not only the College of Education, but engineering and the various sciences. And so I think also that they are reflecting upon their pedagogy, on their own teaching and learning, on how they can foster engagement. And so while the report really focused on K-12, I think in Idaho we're really concerned with preschool all the way to graduate school. And so we oftentimes reference it as P20.
Okay. The National Research Council did have some recommendations on a policy-wide state and district. I want to make sure we touch on that before we completely run out of time. They went to some of the recommendations are to elevate science to the same level as math and reading, to develop effective assessments aligned to new standards, invest in sustained support for STEM teachers, and support future research. In an age where we're having struggles to even fund education, can we afford STEM education at this point?
Definitely. I think with what we've talked about professional development, if we could just sort of integrate that into the classroom, I think it needs to be there. Talking to industry people at the INL and at Micron, they need the engineers to be coming out of Idaho. I mean, we would like some engineers coming out of Idaho, and right now we're not quite there, but we're on the right track to do that. So definitely we need to.
And it starts with the teachers. We have to provide that support for the teachers, the time in the classroom, the training, the preparation prior to reaching the classroom, the ongoing professional training. And as a result of that, our students will have those passionate role models, the people that help bring these fields alive for them, and also to counterbalance some of the societal biases. And I think part of what, when you were referring to the women not sticking with it in these fields, part of it is societal pressure. And we really see that going through the junior high years and on into the high school years. There's really a struggle to stick with those fields if you're a young woman. Even though the opportunities are there, and having the right teachers in there, having role models from the community step in and say, look, stick with it, this is wonderful, look what the world has to offer. Makes a huge difference.
I think that's so true. We were one of the things I think culturally that needs to be addressed. I don't know if you can ever change it. Is that it's the stressing, again, as a parent and as a business person, that people know who a celebrity dirtbag like Kevin Federline is. But I even had to double check the name of who invented the World Wide Web. Oh, that's Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of maybe the single most important thing in my lifetime. It's changed everything, and most people don't know that. Like I said, I had to double check, and it's troubling that we don't glorify these great role models, these brilliant people who've changed the world, and yet we seem to dwell on the Kevin Federlines.
Well, John, you do bring up an interesting, question too about what are we going to do about it, giving science more time in terms of what the NRC, the National Research Council, reports on. And we have these new Common Core standards in mathematics and English language arts, and part of the mathematics is looking at the application of math. And so as we as a state start to interpret how are we going to implement the Common Core standards in mathematics, here is a golden opportunity to make sure that math is being used as well to teach science, and science and the math are being integrated also as the National Research Council report is recommending. In terms of resources, professional development is critical. I mean, we keep coming back to that. But I think there's also a lot that can be done with a little. And as Chris probably knows too, junk drawer engineering, junk drawer physics, junk drawer,
and that's where you need parents.
Kitchen chemistry. I mean, there's a lot that can be done with a little, but we need to make sure teachers and parents are aware of those opportunities, encourage their children to engage in it, and to go out in their backyard or go out in their communities and really explore that, as Jim was talking about with place-based learning, because I think the opportunities are out there. We've just got to really make sure that the teachers and parents are prepared to really encourage children to do that.
We're rapidly running out of time. We've got Glenn on the phone. Stay with me, Glenn. We'll catch you when we flip over to the other side and do the web extras. We will catch you. And I have a couple of Facebook questions that we'll also address when we get into the inside. So I want to kind of wrap up this particular conversation. What should people take away from a STEM discussion? And we're kind of not at the beginning, but not very far from the beginning of making sure Idaho is up to snuff in STEM teaching and STEM education. what advice do you have to pass on to parents and policy leaders? Let's give each of you a real quick chance to say something. And Jim, I'm going to throw it to you first in Moscow.
Fantastic. Joan, I think the report suggests this, but I just want to be explicit. Of course, I'm concerned with the economy of Idaho, and I think to be a player in the new economy, we cannot afford not to invest in STEM. But I also think, as the report suggests, that there's issues regards to good citizenship. We are confronted with some very complex challenges as a nation, and we have to have an informed citizenry to make those difficult decisions. And so I think being STEM literate is just essential for that, whether it's regarding the economy, regarding our society, culture, or the environment. STEM, oftentimes, those disciplines are the kind of the underpinning of many of the critical issues embedded in those challenges.
It's not a nice to have. STEM education is not a nice to have, it's a must have. I mean, it's the foundation for the future and the knowledge economy, we can't ignore it. It's gone too far. Something has to be done right now.
And talking for my students, I think STEM is the future for them. And this STEM is what they love coming to school. Those are the things they're going to remember. They're not going to remember the things what they do in language or maybe a book they read. They're going to remember the activity, the inquiry-based activity, hands-on activity of STEM that is going to get them excited about learning.
Every game, every satisfying pastime has science and mathematics behind it. And if we can help our young people recognize how rich their lives can be through studying these areas, this can help them find things that they're passionate about through their entire lives and hopefully through their careers. It starts with the family. The school contributes to it in partnership with the family. The community contributes to it, and we all benefit. Most of all, the children benefit. But we also have to let these students see that mathematics and science, it's okay to think hard. It's okay to work hard at it. It's worth it because these are wonderful things to study.
Well, and to pick up on that it's lifelong learning, and that
we haven't touched on lifelong
learning.
Yeah,
we haven't, but it's okay not to know this stuff because it's developing so rapidly, but there's lots of opportunities to learn about it, particularly in the informal education arenas. We really haven't talked about that, but one of the NSF program officers was in informal education. But we know 80% of the jobs in the future are going to need some aspect of STEM. And so getting K-12, higher ed, the community and business and industry working collaboratively toward this is going to be key to the success of our students.
All right. Thank you all. I appreciate it very much. We have run out of time. Let me say thank you to James up in Moscow. Thank you for being there. I appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
And here in Boise, Lewis and Holly. Appreciate you gentlemen, Jefferson.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for joining us. Of course, if you have more information about this on our website, you go to idahoptv.org. We have lots of information, including links to that new the research from the science. You can check that out. We'll also have our web extra that we'll be taping right after this. So tune in there, get my notes going here, and follow us on Facebook and join us on Twitter. Thanks for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next time on Dialogue.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Additional funding provided by Idaho National Laboratory, where for 60 years the energy of innovation has lighted the way to progress in energy and national security, basic and applied science and engineering technology, and the education of Idaho's next generation of researchers.
Check out our website, become a friend on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter.